David Coverdale gave an interview to one of the weekly music papers, I think it may have been Record Mirror, in which he promised grievous bodily harm to Ritchie Blackmore for this outrage, but it didn't do any lasting damage to either group.
What if it was one great big publicity stunt?
Yeah, but Ritchie Blackmore, I mean, he's not the, you know, he is the sort that you want to rip his head off, isn't he?
I tend not to get too involved in people because, to be quite honest, I find a lot of people are boring. I find myself boring most of the time.
And good night.
Every Whitesnake album did better than the one before. I think Ready and Willing gave them the idea that they could have hit singles.
It was a new direction for the new decade. It was 1980, and it was when Whitesnake emerged as a really bright and tight and very vigorous hard rock band.
It was still very much blues rock, but slightly more American oriented. I think that's an unfair question because it makes people think like they made an American style rock album. They certainly didn't, but I think there was a slight hint with Fool for Your Lovin' especially. Maybe we can start looking overseas and start recording stuff that Americans will understand as one of the markets we've already got.
From that point on, it was like there were definite songs that, you know, had one eye on the charts. Nothing wrong with that at all, because I mean, you know, Whitesnake are known for being one of the great sort of heavy rock singles bands of that era, and it wasn't until 1987. It wasn't to the detriment of the overall sound of the band and the music that they made.
Pretty much stands up, whereas I'm not so happy about the previous two. A lot of that's to do with the band kind of settling down into and finding its own style. It's the first one that really sounds to me like Whitesnake.
There are many standout tracks on Ready and Willing because I think it was their first great album. I mean, well, it was their defining studio album for many, and there were some really lovely moments on that album as well. And Ready and Willing itself was a pretty top quality track.
Well, I got this crazy feeling inside my soul, and it's driving me insane. I got this crazy feeling, can you feel it, baby? It's driving me out of my mind. I'm talking about sweet satisfaction.
Ian Pace had come into the band to replace Donald Duck Dowell on drums, another Deep Purple alumni.
Ian Pace was, of course, along with John Lord, ex-member of Deep Purple, so now with Coverdale, Lord and Pace, yeah, it kind of upped the ante. Fans very excited by that.
Is it hard work doing all that drumming behind such a loud band?
Physically it's quite demanding. The hardest thing is keeping the sweat out of my eyes, believe it or not. That's the hardest thing. It's fun, but it's not that difficult, other than if you're not feeling like 100%, it can get a bit tiring after half an hour.
And I think it was someone, again, that David Coverdale felt comfortable with. An old mate, someone he knew he could trust, and he was trying to move Whitesnake forward, and I think Dowell had reached the point where he couldn't develop anymore. Ian Pace could, so there was a real opportunity now to push on.
The drummer was an excellent jazz funk style drummer. Neil was more or less forced to fucking play all these busy fucking sequences, right? Whereas with Pace, he was no nonsense, straightforward.
Not to totally denigrate the guy who was on it.
Am I going to call him that?
He was a good young drummer, but his heart was not in really the same sort of place, I think, that hearts were in when it came to making that, or making this kind of music, which is what we called the previous drum, wasn't quite working out, and that therefore who would we ask? And there was, you know, fairly obvious. He was the cheapest guy going, and it was the fairly obvious answer was to ask Ian if he was interested.
The reason I held off from doing anything, I said there were chances of joining other formations, which would have just been sort of like doing a Deep Purple Mark 77, and that wouldn't have been correct. You know, I mean, so we've had a lot of static from the press in England about, oh, it's just Deep Purple under a different name. It's not.
Come and Get It was pretty disappointing after Ready and Willing. I don't think there was anything new to be offered, and it was fairly obvious at that point, looking back certainly, and I'm sure the critics at the time realised that there's something needed to change in Whitesnake, and things certainly did change drastically.
Come and Get It was really the end of an era for Whitesnake. It wasn't the last album that this lineup actually recorded together, but it was really the end of this time within Whitesnake's career. In many ways, this was the best album that was to be made by the era of Coverdale, Neil Murray, John Lord, Mickey Moody, Bernie Marsden and Ian Pace.
I would say Come and Get It was the culmination or the peak of early Whitesnake's style that defines the band as it was then.
But at the time, there was possibly a sense that you know, they were going to have to go a little further. They're going to have to change the sound a little bit. We're in the 80s by this time, and there was a sense of what is Coverdale, what are Whitesnake going to do next, without starting to look a bit incongruous, if you want, in the new decade.
It felt like a bit of a slip, and I don't think Saints and Sinners really rescued the situation too much either.
The Saints and Sinners album was recorded by the lineup which had done the previous two records. Strangely enough, it was recorded and then put on the back burner because Coverdale was not happy with the lineup. He didn't feel it was going anywhere. It's not right. It's not what I want to do. It's a great record, but this lineup isn't working. They don't seem to have the same ambition that I have, and they seem to be rather lazy. So the Saints and Sinners album was recorded, and Coverdale just disbanded the whole group.
Mickey actually left. Then a few months later, David decided to take the band away from the management record company, blah, 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 and at the same time to change the lineup. And he didn't want to work with Bernie anymore. So he wasn't sure about me. He definitely wanted to bring Cozy Powell in. He wasn't sure about John Lord. He wanted to work with Mel Galley. So it was all up in the air for quite a few months. And a lot of what David has said about the attitudes and the kind of atmosphere in the band by that time is true, that we were getting a bit lazy and a bit predictable. The songs to me were starting to get very predictable. Same chord sequences, same grooves. You know, it was too obviously Whitesnake, if you see what I mean.